Chapter 6. The rain started between the time I closed Aunt Annabelle's eyes and the moment I arrived in the kitchen. It was appropriate, I guessed. The sky raining down the tears, Lily Elizabeth did not cry. I could tell she knew, even though I didn't say a word aloud. Watching her determination to be strong made me think of Mama and made me want to weep along with the sky. Two little boys looked up at me, two little eager faces already smeared with breakfast. Lily placed another bowl on the table, this one in front of a chair on the end, the place I assumed my aunt had occupied. I should have taken over the breakfasting, but I sensed the girls' need to keep at it, so I sat. The boys stared at me with wide eyes as their spoons traveled from mouth to bowl and back again. Ollie dribbled molasses on top of the colorless blob in my bowl. Thank you. I managed to pick up my spoon and stir in the thick sweetener. I wouldn't slight her for the world. Yet I had no desire for food of any kind. Aunt Annabelle lay dead in the other room, and I had no idea what to do next. Ollie remained beside my chair. I shoved a spoonful of oatmeal into my mouth and forced it down my throat. That's James and Dan. She nodded at the boys, her brothers. James just turned 6. Dan turned 4 last summer. It's nice to meet you, I said, feeling ridiculous. They looked at each other. I could almost see the thoughts flying between them, requiring no words to be understood. This is... Ollie stopped short, staring at me. Rebecca, I finished for her. A wail pierced the air. The wail of a baby. My heart leaped into my throat. How young of a baby? Could it eat, walk, talk? Ollie scurried up the stairs, while James scowled. Dan copied his brother's face. I had no idea what to say to them. I hadn't had many conversations with little boys, especially those bereft of both their mother and the one who had stepped in to fill her place. How would I tell them their Miss Ada was dead? Even now, did they really understand what dead meant? Cold prickled my skin. I pressed my hands to my face and suggested more fuel for the stove. James and Don both scrambled off the bench seat. You get 2 pieces and I'll carry 3, James said. I can carry 3. Dan hurried after his brother, his face fixed in determination. When they reappeared, small logs overflowed their arms. A wood stove. We used coal at home, but how different could it be? James shoved the fuel into the side of the stove, then shut the grate again as I crossed the floor. My anxiety quickly turned to pleasure, at least on this front. 6 burners and a teapot or coffee pot warmer stand in the back, a warming shelf above, and a hot water reserve too. A larger and newer range than Mama's. I could manage this, even with a different heat source. Maybe I'd like it so much I would ask Arthur to buy one for our home. Ollie returned, carrying a round-faced, golden-haired baby. Oh, I folded the cherub-like child, 7 or 8 months old, in my estimation, into my arms. The baby grabbed my finger and pulled it towards her pink mouth. And who is this little darling? Janie. I bounced the dimpled girl up and down. She giggled and clapped her hands. I pulled her cheek to mine, inhaling her cotton warmed by the sun scent. The next moment, she turned outstretched arms to her sister. Aw, suddenly that I wasn't someone she knew. Does she eat oatmeal too? I asked. Ollie cocked her head at me. Of course. My cheeks warmed. I should have known. I'll fix hers. Not too much. Ollie pulled the high chair close to the table and plunked her sister inside its confines. And no molasses, just a dab of milk. I nodded and went to work. But when I pulled a pitcher of milk from the evaporated cooler in the corner, I stopped. Milk from a cow? I tried to keep the wariness from my voice. Ollie, honey, do y'all have a cow? Yes'm, old Bob. She took the bowl from my hand and began to feed her baby sister. Bob? Maybe she misunderstood my question. James named her that when he was just little. He didn't know milk cows were girls. I see. I rubbed away the wrinkles I felt on my forehead. Was this my aunt's home or the children's? Had Aunt Annabelle taken them in or come to stay? I really needed some answers. Pulling a large shawl from the row of hooks on the wall by the door, I flung it over my head and shoulders. The only thing I could be certain of now was that cows had to be milked every day, twice a day. I assumed someone else had been tending to that task, but if they knew I'd arrived, the job would likely be left to me. I readied myself to plunge into the muddy yard. Can we come too? James' eager eyes slammed into mine. Miss Ada always let us help. Dan nodded along beside his brother. How could I resist? They didn't know yet that Miss Ada had flown to heaven. Ollie, take care of Janie. I opened the folds of the heavy shawl and gathered the boys around my legs before we plunged into the curtain of rain. We splashed past the gate in the garden, moving as fast as their legs would carry them. Old Bob's bawling grew louder. I swooped Dan under my arms and carried him the last little way. By the time we pulled open the barn doors, our clothes hung heavy with water. The agonized plea of the cow spurred me onward. I knew how to do this. I'd been milking since I wasn't much older than Ollie. I grabbed a pail from the wall and found a stool near the stall. Old Bob gazed at me with grateful eyes as I pulled her teats in a steady rhythm. With each stream that hit the bucket, questions swirled in my head. What connected my aunt to this family? How had the children's mother died? When would their father return? Finally, I stripped the last of old Bob's milk, patted her rump, and stood. A large empty barn met my gaze. Several stalls, empty stalls, and double doors at the opposite end. A whining cut through the air. What's out there? James and Dan stopped their game of tag, cheeks red and chest heavy. James managed to push out his words. Tom and Huck, there are mules. And Dandy, added Dan. That's Daddy's horse. Daddy's horse. So this is your daddy's farm then? James nodded. Dan joined him. One question answered, 1,000 more to go. Thunder rumbled outside. I led the mules and the horses into the empty stalls and gathered my shawl again for the return trip through the rain. The boys' clothes still dripped from our first excursion. Oh well. No harm done going back through the rain then. I let them run ahead, though I didn't linger far behind. Stopped on the porch, I called as they bolted through the gate and up the back walkway. Then I spied a blanketed horse tied to a fence post. I left the milk bucket on the porch and sprinted past the boys, stripped off the wet clothes and run upstairs for dry ones. I called as my wet shawl slapped against the board floor of the porch. I followed watery footprints exactly where I knew they'd led, Aunt Annabelle's bedroom. A man in dark suit stood over the bed. Ollie watched from behind him. Janie, quiet in her arms. I took the baby from her as the doctor, I assumed, from the black bag he carried, turned. Ollie threw herself at his middle. His heavy, gray mustache twitched as the girl's sobs broke the unnatural quiet. I blinked back tears of grief and relief. The doctor looked at me from under scruffy brows before he turned his attention back to Ollie. Hush now, child. He knelt down. Her head moved to his shoulder, her arms stealing around his neck. Miss Ada isn't sick anymore. Yeah, didn't want her to be sick, remember? His R's rolled slightly, hinting of a homeland beyond American shores. Ollie shook her head as he lifted her. I shushed a whimpering Janie. His gaze moved past me to the doorway. I whipped around. James and Dan stood naked and unashamed, their eyes big in bloodless faces. My cheeks warmed. Clothes on boys. I shooed them from the room, blocking the doorway with my body. They ran up the stairs. I bit my lip and turned back to the old man. He returned Ollie to the floor. If you'll see to the little ones, he said to her, we'll tend to things here. She nodded and took Janie from me. I stepped aside. After one long look at the still figure on the bed, Ollie retreated to the chaos upstairs. The man nodded at me after Ollie disappeared. Sheriff told me you'd come. Yes, but not soon enough. I glanced at Aunt Annabelle's waxen face, a face that resembled the doll Daddy bought me for my 10th birthday. 'Twasn't much to be done. The Spanish flu hit hard and quick, but at least ye can care for the children. The children? I felt my whole face crinkle with a frown. I understand this is their daddy's farm? He lifted one of Aunt Annabelle's cold hands, laid it gently across her chest. Frank Gresham, his wife Claire, didn't make it through her last birthday. Janie, my whisper faded amidst the thumping overhead. Frank already been shipped to France. Annabelle moved in. She'd been helping out around here since they were babies. All three took to them as her family, seeing as she had no one else. My face crumpled with sadness instead of confusion. My aunt had no one else because Mama refused to speak to her. How could Mama have let it come to this? The thumping from upstairs calmed a bit, the quiet silencing my questions. Y'all want to dress her, I think. The doctor's words broke through my musing and stole all moisture from my mouth. Did he think I knew how to do what he asked of me? Weren't there women in town, Aunt Annabelle's friends, who would be better suited for such tasks? He walked from the room. I followed, shutting the door behind me. You won't have time for laying her out. We need to get her buried. Likely there'll be few who can leave their own home to attend. I didn't know which disturbed me more, his reading of my mind or his intimidation that Aunt Annabelle wasn't the only fatality. I knew influenza could take the old and the young and the ones already sick with other ailments, but my aunt didn't fit those descriptions. Will someone come for her? Croaked from my throat. The doctor scratched behind his ear, agitating a tuft of hair that afterward refused to lay flat again. Tomorrow morning, early. Can ye have everyone ready? Yes, but could I really ready a woman for burial? Then a more terrible thought struck. Could I prepare these children to witness it? I guess the children have to be there. I ventured the words past my fear, hoping for a tiny reprieve. He answered in a grunt I interrupted as agreement. No one else to care for them. Everyone around here has their own to tend. Did I read fear in his face too? My fingers curled around one another as I gathered my courage. We'll be ready. His eyes turned stern before he spoke again. And there's to be no church or school until ye hear further. Don't want this spreading any more than it has. His words sank deep and heavy, like a boulder dropped in a pond. He opened the back door to leave. Wait! I followed him out onto the porch, the boy's wet clothes tangling my feet. Will you please send a telegram to my mother, Margaret Hendrickson, in Downingtown, Oklahoma? Could you tell her what has happened? His shoulders sagged as if I had handed him a 50-pound sack of flour to carry along with his regular load, but he didn't falter as he jotted the information onto a pad of paper, then climbed into his buggy. I stood in the yard, arms crossed my chest. In the morning, we would bury my mother's sister. By tomorrow evening, I hoped to hear from Mama. She'd tell me what to do next. And that's the end of chapter 6. I will see you next week for chapter 7.